starting. Hi, welcome to the stream. I am Josh Rushing, and because of COVID-19 and the quarantine, you are in my home. So this is a warning. I have 4 kids tucked away in the bedroom. My wife is working the camera and the lights, which is not her usual occupation, but we're going to do the best we can. If you're joining us on YouTube, feel free to jump in on that live chat over there, get some of your thoughts into it, and maybe we'll get those into the show. On this show, we're talking about police reform. This is just a huge issue sweeping across America. Trump's supposed to come out this week with his recommendations for police reform. And all this is in response to what's been happening in the streets here. First, it was an 8-minute, 46-second video of the death of George Floyd at the hands of white police officers in Minneapolis. As people flooded to the streets to protest that police brutality, here's how the police chose to respond.
Police drove a vehicle into a crowd of people protesting there.
In Los Angeles, police swing batons at people who witnesses say were simply standing with their hands up.
A New York police officer caught on camera pushing a woman who was demonstrating.
An officer pulling a man's face mask off and spraying him with pepper spray.
This unsettling image of an officer kicking a woman who was maced.
Caught on camera, a protester run over by an HPD mounted patrol unit at the height of the protests.
That's how they responded to the accusation of police brutality and the protest about it. I want to take you to my laptop right now and show you, because this is what the protests were actually about, and this is police violence in communities across the country. You can follow this timeline and see as it just rolls across the U.S. I'm going to go to our first guest here. Simone, will you, I know you're with the Marshall Project, will you first introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the Marshall Project, and then give us a sense of how did we get here? This is police violence in communities across the country. You can follow this timeline.
Justice was not in the forefront. So the idea initially why our name is Project is we thought, let's influence the 2016 presidential election. At that time, this is before Ferguson, people were talking about in the environment, education, but really criminal justice was not in the front burner. So we launched a couple months after Ferguson, and I am the police reporter, the national law enforcement reporter. So I've been busy for the last 6 years. And what we try to do at the Marshall Project, I have an academic background. Many of us are former attorneys. A lot of us have graduate level degrees. Is let's approach journalism for the mindset of let's look at data, let's do deep dives, let's look at history. So we're a lot different than sort of the mainstream daily newspaper. We really love context at the Marshall Project.
Yeah, and at Fault Lines, we love the Marshall Project. We've actually had you on before to talk about, it was for an episode called American Sheriff, and it was, the work you guys do is vital. Give me a bit of a quick historical walkthrough as to how we found ourselves in this moment.
So I will try to sum up about 250, 300 years of law enforcement in this country really quickly. So I always like to start off that, remember, America is a place that's different depending on what state you're in. So is policing. So the history of policing, we should look at it first through the South, and then let's look at it through the northern cities like Boston and New York. So really quickly, in the South, we do have a legacy, obviously, of slavery and slave patrols. And I would say before about the 1850s, you had bands of white men going around attacking Black Americans who were escaping for their freedom. And even when slavery was over, and I put that in air quotes, you have the first band of the federal government coming in and saying, hey, we cannot allow sort of local law enforcement to continue to abuse Black Americans. And a lot of people really don't know this, but laws today, we call this the color of law statute in federal case law, looking at prosecuting bad cops actually ties back to 1866, which is when the federal government passed a law to say, hey, you cannot abuse your power just saying, hey, I'm acting in the means of law enforcement. So that's the South and that quick history. And let's look at the North. The first police department in this country, municipal police department, was actually Boston. I believe around the late 1830s, and that's modeled after what was going on in London. So you had this sort of idea that can police departments, and again, I'm talking more about the history of like Boston and New York City. I'm not talking about the South, it's its own different history. Can we have big government policing? Can we go around and do crime control and police neighborhoods and interact with the community? And so what I find really interesting as time went on, you had the Great Migration, you had Black Americans moving to Chicago, Boston, New York City. Now look at policing today, right? Like it's still disproportionately when we have police violence, it's impacting communities of color. But it's very interesting to look at the history because Boston and New York started its police department more like, hey, we're becoming an industrialized city. Let's have a police department like London. And then the South had its own, which was more or less born out of slave patrols. And look at it today. No matter what city you're in, whether you're Boston, Portland, Omaha, Nebraska, most likely if there's police violence, most likely it's going to impact communities of color.
I want to bring up the cover of the New Yorker right now. I think it's called Say Their Names. It's a drawing of George Floyd. Let me see, I have it here. Check this out. This talks about the history. So you start down at the bottom of it, and you basically see the images of slavery to include the abuse. Of course, all of it was abuse, up through the Jim Crow era, just going from the bottom up with the lynchings. And then right in the middle there, you see Rodney King, that where the cops are around him and he's on the ground, the vehicles in the background. That's from the Rodney King video. And then, of course, it's Tamir Rice and Eric Garner. And all the way at the top, of course, is George Floyd. I mean, just in recent history, since the Civil Rights Act, you have Watson, 65 and 66. That was about police brutality. You have LA in 92. That was about police brutality. You have Ferguson, police brutality, and now you have the George Floyd protest. Hassan, I'd like to bring you in at this point. Former police officer, chief of police in Greenville, North Carolina, is that right? Can you introduce yourself and tell us what you're doing now, and then I'll throw a question to you.
Yes, so my name is Hassan Aden. I am a retired police chief. I served in two departments, Alexandria, Virginia, retired from there, and then was appointed chief in Greenville. My move to Greenville was as a result of that department needing to be reformed thoroughly from absolutely the inside out. What I do now is I work on several consent decrees. I'm the federal monitor in Cleveland. I oversee the reform around, the highest profile was the Tamir Rice case. I also serve as a deputy monitor in Baltimore, overseeing various aspects of the reforms as a result of the Freddie Gray murder. And I work on reform all around the country. I've worked on Walter Scott, North Charleston, Jamar Clark, Minneapolis, Freddie Gray, and Tamir Rice.
So when you watched the George Floyd video, what thoughts went through your head?
I was speechless, horrified.
And as you watched the police response to the protest, like, what are you thinking as a cop?
That they're just proving the point. I had an emotional reaction to just a few that you showed, but there are hundreds more of just examples of basically policing unhinged, uncontrolled, even in departments that I know have good leadership, that their officers, at the street level in those environments, lost it.
Why?
I think a lot of it goes down to frustration and the many different frustrations, but really that bad conduct, the assaultive conduct, is a result of a lack of accountability or perceived lack of accountability, where they're just lashing out and doing things that, the world saw what happened as a result. And it really highlights the need for, I don't think that it's, either reform, defund, or dismantle. I think it's all three. All three things need to happen. We have over 18,000 police departments in the United States, and it's completely decentralized. They're under the control of municipalities or states, and all have different policies. There is no way to it's a battleship. You can't turn it, doesn't turn quickly. It's not, a speedboat. It's going to turn slowly. And some departments need to be abolished today. Some departments need to be reformed. Many departments need to be reformed. And I think policing in general, we need to look at defunding seriously. I don't like the term defunding. I like to call it something like reimagining the policing model and the actual model. What does policing need to be today in 2020? Not based on what Simone talked about the history of policing was. We know that well. The notion, the context of policing is founded on something horrible, and it's continued all these years. We need to just raise that and start all over.
There appears to be this sense that cops often believe they're kind of above the law, or at least they act in a way as if they're above the law. And on Fault Lines, we were curious about that culture, and we started to investigate it. And a colleague of mine did an interview with the head of the Chicago Police Union. And I was a little surprised by his answer. Check it out here.
Do you think there's a code of silence in the department?
There's a code of silence everywhere. Everybody has it. When we have people in the clergy that are sexually assaulting young kids or people in seminaries and others know about it and they just transfer them, is there a code of silence there? Is there?
There is, but
Sure
that doesn't
there is.
make it right. That makes it very
No,
wrong.
but so why would this profession be any different?
But so it's something that needs to change in your opinion.
I don't think anybody, in this day and age, anybody that does anything that jeopardizes the livelihood of their job for their family, to stand up for somebody that they know is doing something they shouldn't be doing is silly.
Couple things to take out of there about the culture. One, he's using pedophile priests to justify a code of silence within the police ranks. And he's the head of the union in Chicago. And then the second thing is at the end is he says anyone who stands up to do the right thing at their own expense, well, they're silly. How in the world can you live your life as a cop and have that kind of attitude?
Yeah, it's absolutely mind-boggling. And he's not the only one. I mean, we saw union leadership in Minneapolis. Bob Kroll came out and said some ridiculous things. Unions are necessary to protect, the rights of certain of officers. But I think that they have, that pendulum has swung entirely over. When we're hearing things like this, police officers fundamentally don't want to hear that. And is there a thin blue line? I believe that it exists in a lot of places. But there are programs that are being implemented in some major cities like EPIC in New Orleans. EPIC stands for Ethical Policing is Courageous. And essentially what it is, and if Minneapolis had it, with the George Floyd case, the George Floyd case would not have occurred. EPIC basically trains officers to intervene when they see other officers doing things that are illegal, wrong, overcharging people, whatever the case may be. And it gives, basically, when you're trained in EPIC, you wear a pin and you're giving other officers consent to intervene on your behalf if you start behaving in a certain way. And the intervention.
In the Floyd video, the 3 officers that held people back could have intervened, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And should have.
There was a moment in the protest as the people in the streets were looking at the police and their millions and millions of dollars worth of military equipment and then being attacked by them. I think it occurred to some people, maybe for the first time, that, oh yeah, we're paying for that. We're paying for them. We're paying for all that equipment, and we need to stop. And so the chants became defund the police. Now, this isn't a new movement, and over the last week or so, this has been kind of debated, the nuances of it. So I want to bring in Rana. Rana, can you give us a little bit of your background while you're here today? And let's talk about, what do people mean when they say abolish police, defund the police, or police reform? I think the devil's in the details here.
Absolutely. So my name is Rana Sultan, and I am a journalist and an abolitionist organizer. And I'm one of the co-authors of the 8 to Abolition site, which I formed with some other abolitionist organizers. And the reason we did that was because there had been a different campaign called 8 Can't Wait, which was funded by Campaign Zero. And the point of that was to introduce 8 reforms that they claimed would reduce police violence and murder by 72%. For us, 72% less police murders is not enough. We have an opportunity here to make 100% fewer police murders, and that is through abolitionist reforms, which get us closer to abolition. So for me and other abolitionists, we are grounded in theory that is decades old. These are people like Angela Davis, Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, Miriam Kaba. Abolition is not new, and I think that that's something that people have been kind of pushing lately, that we just came up with abolition today. But in theory, it's actually something that mostly Black women and femmes have actually been working through and thinking through for decades and decades. And so for me, defunding is just a way for us to get closer to full abolition. So that is taking away as much money from police departments as fast as possible so that we can really negate the effects that they have, especially on communities of color. The less police presence, the less violence.
Well, let me throw this at you. This is from our YouTube community, from someone named Nile, I believe is how it might be pronounced. And it says, police is one of the bastions of society. Without it, our brittle society would fall apart and its balance would go haywire.
Sure. I think that this is something that a lot of people believe. But the thing is that police haven't always existed. Like was pointed out earlier, they're something that were born out of slave patrols and in Boston out of the need to protect private property. And that's how it's remained for 200 years. They are protecting private property and they are hurting Black and brown communities. And I think that we really need to be imaginative to think about a world in which we can respond to harm in ways that don't include creating more harm. And that's what abolition really wants. And what we really don't talk about a lot is that police are often people who are causing this harm. They're not only murdering people, as we've seen, they're not only attacking protesters, as we've seen, but the second largest complaint against police is actually sexual violence. So we actually see that there are so many people who are survivors of sexual violence by police, and abolishing them is one step towards making sure that sexual violence isn't something that is commonplace.
So, Rana, in a system of capitalism where inequality is a built-in part of the system, many people see police as the gatekeepers for that inequality. Well, can you connect capitalism to police and abolish the police and how that would work within a capitalist society?
Absolutely. So for full-scale abolition, we would need to be abolishing capitalism as well. And I know that that is very scary for a lot of Americans, but I was listening to a webinar yesterday with Angela Davis, and she said that capitalism really is to justice in this society, and we would need to abolish it to get to full abolition. But myself and other abolitionists do understand that this isn't something that's going to happen overnight. And so there are abolitionist reforms that we can implement today, and those do not necessarily require the dismantling of capitalism that we should be aspiring to. And so that is with 8 to Abolition, all of those demands are things that could happen tomorrow, and they're all faced with municipal districts as well as city councilors, mayors, because as it was said earlier, I think that a lot of these police departments are municipal. So it's not something that at the federal level changes, but we can make these small incremental changes on the municipal level. And that's what 8 to Abolition was really calling for.
Hey, Rana, where can people go and find those 8 recommendations?
Sure. It's on 8toabolition.com. And it's all right there. We have PDF versions. We're working on translating it into 20 different languages as well. And I think there's an ASL version on YouTube now.
I want to bring in a sound from a bite from someone in our community here. Layla Raven connects police violence to racism. Let's check it out.
For so many of our communities, violence comes at the hands of police. 1,000 people are killed by police every year. Black people are 3 times as likely to be killed as white people. 50% of people killed by police are people with disabilities. And sexual assault is the second most common form of police brutality, not to mention that 40%, up to 40% of police officers are domestic abusers. So already our communities are not turning to the police for safety. We turn to our own community.
Simone, why is that? Why is police violence disproportionately affecting Black people?
Well, one of my big things I like to talk about is who are the cops? Like, who are they hiring? Who are these people? And I've done stories looking at barriers to recruitment. So do we think cops tend to have graduate degrees, backgrounds when they went to college in social work or learning languages? Most big city departments don't even have a college requirement. When they instituted a college requirement, one place like Philadelphia, which is just a 2-year minimum, like an associate's degree, they found it was hard to recruit. So the first issue I have is when we look at the problem of policing in this country, it's more or less a blue-collar profession, and it more or less appeals to those with a military background, something I've written about, looking at about 1/5 of people who work in policing say they have served in the U.S. Armed Forces. So we did a story, and believe it or not, no one really looked at this from an academic level. What is the impact of seeing combat and then becoming a police officer? And what we found is not really surprising, right? If you see combat, then you go work in a big city as a cop, tend in a community of color, you're going to rack up use of force complaints. So I find that my big frustration about writing about policing for so long is we could fix this problem if we just professionalize the staff. And it's really hard to professionalize the staff. I went to graduate school in criminology, and none of my classmates wanted to go on and become a local police officer. Most went to work as a federal agent or a prosecutor or work in academia. For those of us in white-collar professions, being a local cop is something we laugh at.
Hassan, I want to talk about the defunding of the police. I'm going to pull up a tweet here. This is actually from Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, and it's looking at the Detroit budget. It appears on here that it's almost, looks like $300 million a year for the police, which is far more than everything else combined. But if you really kind of zoom in, I mean, it's in the single digits what they spend on health, or here's housing at 12 million compared to 300 for policing. Well, why are police getting so much of the budgets in the city, and what should be done about that?
Well, I think that if you drill down in most police budgets, you'll see that 80 to 90% are personnel costs. But in a budget like that, where you have 300 million, the remainder is still a large chunk of public funds. And I think that in terms of defunding the police, we really need to be looking at what is the expectation of law enforcement in our communities. You know, over time, the police have become, social workers, all of these different roles that were not part of their core mission. Crisis intervention teams. And I'm not saying that these aren't necessary, because they do need to be able to recognize someone in crisis. But I think that defunding the police in certain areas is appropriate, and create teams that are professional, that can come in and do the work. But the thing is, though, if you defund certain aspects of policing, you have to take away that responsibility as well and create a professional cadre of people that can help with the homeless, that can respond in cases where someone's undergoing a mental health crisis, or someone is in some other type of crisis. So I think that, given very careful thought about how to deconstruct certain parts of policing and move that money over into a more appropriate set of folks that can do that work, I think that is absolutely something that cities ought to be looking at.
When you look at all that money being spent on police, and you imagine it being spent on education, on libraries, on parks, on schools, what you're imagining just isn't defunding police, but it's rebuilding a complete different society. And it makes me think of the Frederick Douglass quote, that it's easier to build strong children than it is to repair broken men. This right now seems to be a chance for America to reconsider not just the police, but the entire system from the ground up. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining me today on the stream. Femi will be back tomorrow, and I'll see you again on Wednesday.